Welcome, everyone. This is the Family Farm Defenders podcast on the theme of land access, land justice in the context of food sovereignty and healthy food for everyone. And my name is Stephen Bartlett with the Sustainable Agriculture of Louisville, calling in from my farm in the Dominican Republic. And we are with Annette Hiatt from Land Loss Prevention in North Carolina, and Nathan Galaviz, who is with the Agrarian Trust. He is residing in Western North Carolina, but they are a national organization. Maybe I could ask each of you to just briefly introduce yourself and what brings you to this topic, if you'd like to share something. Annette, would you like to go first?
Sure. Good morning, and thank you all so much for having us here. My name, again, is Annette Hiatt. I'm an attorney with the Land Loss Prevention Project, and we are a nonprofit law firm based in North Carolina, and we provide at no cost legal assistance to folks trying to protect their ownership and access to land, and that's what brings me here today.
Beautiful, yeah, and pleasure to meet you, of course, Stephen and Annette. I feel like we have kind of been, we orbit in some of the same circles, right? And so, but just pleasure to be in this conversation. So, right, my name is Nathan Michael Galaviz. I'm coming from Western North Carolina, incidentally. And so, Agrarian Trust is a national nonprofit farmland trust that focuses on land access and decommodification of land. And my role within Agrarian Trust is I'm a commons manager, and I'm working on a team leading the Commons Initiative of Agrarian Trust, which is our mechanism for decommodifying land. It's a nonprofit model, but there's about a dozen commons in varying stages of development across the country. These regional autonomous efforts towards community-led governance and stewardship of land.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Nathan. I'm Stephen Bartlett, the Director of Sustainable Agriculture of Louisville and part of the U.S. Food Sovereignty Alliance, which Agrarian Trust has been an important fiscal sponsor for some time now. I'm at the moment on my family farm in the Dominican Republic, but I do a lot of land access work in Louisville, Kentucky with immigrant population, very experienced immigrant farmers and native-born and people of color farmers who are accessing land in the city and nearby the city of Louisville. So I have some direct understanding, not only in the global South, but also in the urban settings in the United States about land access. Maybe I'll just throw that out here. Just what is the basic need for land access for farmers? Yeah.
Affordable land access is important because it's kind of the crux of everything that we say that we want in terms of food and agriculture, certainly nonprofit organizations and funders. So if we're talking about local food, if we're talking about climate resiliency, if we're talking about thriving communities is kind of a generalized term. Which communities are we talking about? In this context, I'm thinking rural communities, and also fair farm labor. If the price of land, farmland, is set by speculation, then it becomes a pay-to-play game, and we can already see it in hundreds of years of history, in decades of history, and certainly in the last decade or so, that the folks, farming becomes on one end, on the smaller scale, a hobby, a luxury hobby, and then on the other side, something that the already wealthy do. And so in that instance, agriculture is no longer a public good. And so now affordable access is important because it's determining who gets to farm and then what kind of farming is possible and whether farms can make choices like prioritizing soil health and prioritizing social justice, land justice, rematriation, and food access as opposed to simply servicing debt. And so if the entry ticket is too expensive, we are going to lose the next generation. And in there, much land has been lost. Many opportunities to transfer to the next generation have already been lost. And that is the trend that we are bucking against, kind of like a candle in the wind. So we do have a chance to repair the harm. Yeah, that's why it's important.
Thank you. Annette, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good answer. When I was listening to your joke, I thought you were going to say that he was just going to pay off debt. Because that's ultimately the place that a lot of small farmers, big farmers, all farmers find themselves in is managing a debt load, which goes directly to what Nathan is raising. Is if you can't access land in the first place, where you're managing debt, there's not really room to expand thinking, expand processes or types of what you're growing. I also think it's important to define all the ways where we need justice in the food system. Whether that's fair wages or safe working conditions, fair prices for the products that are grown, ample and affordable food for consumers, environmental stewardship of land and water. And it goes directly to that question, because if you can't get folks that have more holistic views on the land itself, we're going to be kind of in a repeating cycle. Almost 1 million acres of farmland has been lost over 20 years in North Carolina. And what you're seeing is just the expansion of urban areas, peri-urban areas, suburban sprawl. Like in the county that I live in, there's a housing development that is 8,000 acres. And that probably wasn't active farmland before, but it is definitely gone now. And so I feel like, part of the focus on land loss and succession is also like, what policies do we have that actually kind of address growth as well? So you have like the financial side of making sure that farmers can make a living, that we have a resilient food system, but also like, what are we doing about the land itself and access to the land? So I think this is a really big question, with lots of need for evolution, I think.
Yes. Lately, I've been thinking about how this issue is not just in the United States. This is a worldwide issue. And I'm thinking in particular of what's happening right now in this rural community here in the Dominican Republic. In the United States, we often talk about suburban sprawl and development happening on farmland as retiring farmers want to sell their farms and try to retire on that income. And that a very similar thing is happening, and much faster than I could have imagined it here in this rural area that I'm in right now. We're about 5 miles, 6 miles from the nearest town in two directions on the coast of the Atlantic Ocean here in the Dominican Republic. And back in 1989, when we bought this land for $1,000 an acre, with that, it was there was no paved road, there was no electricity, there was no running water. Now all those things are present, and so people from the town who want to live in a quieter, have a garden, they can get here very easily on the very new paved road. But unfortunately, it's only relatively wealthy people who can do it. And the first who have purchased plots of land now sold by the meter rather than by the acre or the hectare, have moved in, and they are retired military Dominican who served in the U.S. military for 20 years. He's our first new neighbor, become a suburbanite. But he grew up on a farm, so he's planted his land with a lot of crops. But as you say, it's like a hobby farming inside a development that's got its own restrictions and its own development, and it very much like gated communities developing in the United States. Annette, you work with a lot of people who are facing the loss of farmland because of debt. And how does that dynamic that I just described play out among the folks you work with?
Yeah, that's a really heavy question. Because we often, because we give direct legal assistance, we are working with folks that are very near the point where there's been a foreclosure filed. And sometimes that is because there's a farm debt. Sometimes it is related to taxes on property that have become too high. And so it is also when you have the owners of air property, which is one of the other areas that we spend a lot of time talking about, is family owned land, where there's multiple people that hold land together and they have to come together to manage it and to pay debt or to pay expenses or taxes. But they also have to decide what to do with the land together, which makes it a little bit difficult in terms of improving the land or adding elements of farming that cost money, because you can't use the land as security without everyone coming together. So we're often, walking alongside people as they make very difficult decisions of how to maintain family legacy on land, to save it for the next generation, and to just maintain it. So I'm not sure that I'm answering your question exactly, but it is kind of one of those things that's very difficult to kind of wade through, especially when you're trying to balance budgets. It's very much, as we've already kind of talked about, it's related to that commodification of land. It's when you're looking at a budget, it's like, how much can you bring in versus how much debt is there, and it takes away from the underlying value of the land itself.
Mm-hmm. Nathan, I was struck by your use of the term public agriculture as a public good, and I think that concept, I think, may be worth talking about some more, because in the United States, property and private property is considered it's almost a deified concept.
Mm-hmm.
And ever since the Europeans came to the New World, that concept befuddled and was considered outrageous and incomprehensible by the native people of North America, for example. I like that concept, and so maybe you could say a little bit more about how that concept is conceived in the context we're in now.
100%. Yeah, of course. Well, especially in today, 2026, in our modern, very divisive political climate, it becomes really hard to imagine some of these things that maybe at one time might have been titled democratic or titled social movements. And you touched on this colonial, patriarchal, extractive ideal that is very much within the American ethos of, this is my land and I own it, and if I want to drill for oil or mine or extract every last natural resource to my own benefit, then God provides that I will do so, and it's my right as an American. Like, just so far and gone from a worldview that incorporates right relationship, not just with people, but with all living things, right? And so, and this notion of a public good, I believe, is inherent in our common humanity, even outside of an individual, you could say religious or spiritual, ethical, moral framework. And it is through a combination of assumptions that has led us so far astray, right? Like, I think about how I'm not an academic, so I guess my perspective is limited, but from an academic standpoint, you read a report and you read a book and you incorporate these assumptions into a worldview. And then one builds upon the other in this very kind of linear way that races toward a conclusion based on understanding. And I think about historically how even, as recent as 100 years or as far away as several hundred years, what was modern or conventionally understood ended up being proven to be so far from the truth, right? So, but in terms of land loss and like this conversation that we're having, it's not accidental, right? Obviously, it's a produced circumstance. And when we talk about the market dynamics, it's not just a economic story; it is a policy story, right? And so what happens when you're combining fragile farm economics with a legal system that treats land primarily as private property and financial value? And so when the land, farmland, or any real estate is the retirement plan, the bank account, and the collateral all in one, then it's one shock disrupting event away from being ripped out of the hands of the people who have access to it. Look, regardless of the ownership structure, we're talking about the working lands in right relationship with the people that are honoring them. And heirs property alone has cost millions of acres for Black farmers. And so land loss is chronic. We really we speak about this as a crisis in this country, right? Because farming is such a low margin business operating inside of an incredibly high cost real estate market. So one bad season, one health crisis, one market shift is going to push a family or an individual or a group into having to sell. And for farmers of color, this is layered on top of historic generational theft and exclusion and discriminatory lending policy and violence and intimidation, predatory contracts, and unfulfilled promises within government agencies, on and on and on and on, that they came to the door proposing to support and help farmers, and that help never reached.
Annette, I'd like to ask you to follow up on Nathan's very descriptive comment. If you could describe from your perspective why people of color, African American farmers, have been losing land at a much faster rate and have historically lost a tremendous amount of their land since the 1930s, and what dynamics are still at play in that difference of speed of land loss.
Again, a really great big question. I think Nathan did just such a great job of laying out kind of the barriers on barrier on barrier on barrier. I feel like there have historically been, as was mentioned, all kinds of restrictive and discriminatory policies. If you're looking from the 40s, the 20s, the 30s, 20s, 30s, 40s, you have redlining. You have discriminatory lending and citing of where people could live. You have documented civil rights cases that have been in the court system that show incidences of lending disparities between white and Black farmers and white and Latino farmers and women farmers and Native American farmers, where it was shown that there were differences in the lending practices that damaged the ability of those farmers to hold on to land. Those were multiple and long time litigation cases. So I think it is one practice after another And the barriers have grown higher because the systems are more entrenched. The form of discrimination changes, so that it isn't the same kind of siting. It's not the same steering for housing, but the barriers are still in place. And I think there's a view, an ingrained system that says that people without access are less deserving for access, that they've done something wrong to not be able to hold on to the land or to be able to access the land. And it kind of just pits people against each other in terms of, well, I was able to do it, why can't you? And I think that that's one of the things that has to kind of be undone, to be able to move forward, is the view that somehow someone has done something, that they lost their land, or that heir owners didn't write a will, and so it was their fault that the ownership of land got fractionated. But the reality is that heir property is created whether you write a will, and sometimes even, whether you don't write a will, or even sometimes when you do, because landowners want to pass their land to the next generation, to their children. They want to ensure access. But when you write a will and you say, well, to all three of my children, then you're creating a form of joint ownership, which then causes, access issues. So I feel like, there have been just, stacking of these things that limit the ability. And during those years too, people left, and there's a lot of folks that left from areas where it wasn't safe to be, to follow jobs to the north, and that kind of separates people in kind of where they feel connected to, as well. So.
Thank you. It's a very heavy issue, and when you work directly with people who are in the process of losing land or almost losing land, that's a very heavy and difficult, emotionally fraught circumstance. Here where I am in the Dominican Republic, this land was originally sort of settled with no land titles. It was in the 30s and 40s. It was like a rainforest that hadn't yet been settled, and hundreds of families moved over a period of time into this area and cut down some trees to have a little food crop area, garden. And they used to release their pigs into the wild forest to reproduce. And then after a year or so, they'd go and hunt them. Recently, one of the larger landowners, who's been doing dairy for many years here, is selling off his land into plots. And right next to my friend's house is a plot that was sold off to a relative of this man who lived in the United States and had the money to come and buy this piece of land. And the other day they went and they just, against all the laws, they went and cut down all the fruit trees that were there in that corner of her new land, the avocado trees and the palm trees and the mango trees. It was like a holocaust for those of us who've been eating off those fruits. And the local folks depend on, it was considered a common good. The fruit trees, you eat what you can, but there's always a surplus. So everyone's heart fell when they saw the fruit trees cut down. And yeah, I have one of the last smaller scale farms in the area, which is a 10-acre land. Most of the farms here are 50, 70, 80, 100, 200, 300 acre cattle ranches. And so I'm kind of a holdout for a small family farm size property. And in my view, I'm willing to take a loss, invest my pension fund, my Social Security income now, into paying for field work, and that's not going to repay itself from the production of the farm, but some of it will be repaid, but it will increase the food production of the farm, and I think many farmers are facing these decisions. I know Family Farm Defenders have a lot of the board members and members of Family Farm Defenders have recently lost their herds of cattle. They've had to sell them because of many issues around the pricing of milk, but in general, the similar trend among small and middle-sized agriculture in the United States. Maybe we can talk about some of the solutions that might be available to this issue. What are the short, medium, and long-term steps that we might take, do you think, to try to push back the land loss, and to push back against the marginalization of good farming, basically?
Well, it's a comprehensive question, and I think short, medium, and long term can take very different strategies. Another thing that I noticed too in the collaborative governance work is it ties to this thread of private ownership that, when you own something, by law, you control it and you control the decision making of it. And there are many people that I see that say, well, I don't want other people affecting what I believe is ideal or right. And so I don't want anybody else telling me what to do. And in collective governance, that's not an option. Those mindsets become outliers in favor of the compromise in the face of conflict as to what is going to benefit more than the individual and expand the impact of any given decision. And so pushing against those impulses is extra work. It's extra effort. It costs more. It takes longer. And so what's the reason why someone would do that? What motivates people towards this collaborative governance? And how do you make people move? There are many different strategies. And I'm not an attorney, but from the legal context, when we utilize things like leases, bylaws, articles of incorporation, entity choice, we're using the tools that we have at hand within our American legal system to codify governance. And I forget exactly where I was going with that, but I'm trying to tie it into this notion of succession, which is kind of what I was hearing in the previous conversation, and then in this speaking of how the commons can be disrupted through this sort of skewed idea of control and ownership, and this generational transition. The American Farmland Trust put out some numbers in 2017 that they've recently re-upped, but it's still relevant because here, 2026, we're leaning in on 10 years, where they were talking about 400 million acres that we're going to transition. But probably y'all have heard this, and maybe people who are listening to this will have heard that number before. Coincidentally, it's the similar amount of land that was bought in the Louisiana Purchase. So that's the scale of the transition that we're talking about. And so the choices that we make and the motivations behind them can either renew, or it can reinvigorate, or it can accelerate decline and displacement. And so when these retiring farmers now, and retiring through an economic struggle as well, becomes increasingly difficult. So the land is often going to the highest bidder, right? And this is speculation. Investors, developers. It's also, especially in farm country, neighbors consolidating, right? And then you spoke to this trend, which I think is everywhere, probably global, but definitely in my experience, everywhere in rural US, lifestyle buyers. The Airbnb, the scenic land usage, which for Agrarian Trust as a conservation organization, we are adjacent to, and some of this type of decision making amongst our peers in the land trust community that enforces this type of scenic land use that has a very surface level values alignment in regards to preservation and conservation, but doesn't reach the surface in regards to access for people and communities. Right. So also this work that we do, the forces of speculation and consolidation that move against the work that we do operate at breakneck speed and at a massive scale. And so you can't outbid a hedge fund with a CSA, right? And so, and also when land and farming and agriculture becomes a hobby or a lifestyle product, then stewardship and right relation can often, and land access can then, it's an afterthought. It's a nice to have instead of maybe tying in with my point before, codified in the governance decisions from the start. So yeah, so this succession crisis has already begun to roll into a massive land grab with very few and far between intervention. So this operative question of like, who in a moment of crisis or in a moment of transition, who gets the right to intervene or refuse or buck the trend? Is it capital, in air quotes, or is it community, in air quotes? So right, I think probably good about there.
Right, because we don't have a priority for people. If it's a purchase, it's an investment. Land and real estate is viewed as a very stable investment for people that have the money to invest. And as the farmers are aging, right, the average age is 58. It's just increasing. But what you're seeing in the statistics, the census of agriculture that happens every 5 years, is that farm ownership is declining. So in 2022, they saw the lowest number of farms since the Civil War. And at the same time, the loss of farmland. But what you're seeing is the average farm size at the same time is getting bigger. So it's absolutely showing the consolidation of farming, and like the type of agriculture that happens on very large farms changes. In North Carolina, you can't look at our farms, right, and compare them to farms in Iowa. All of our farms are small comparatively. Most of our farmers in North Carolina are on 50 acres or less. That's the majority, but that's not the same as, many other states. And I feel like, that's absolutely kind of looking at the long term, like how do you weigh out that capital compared to community? And right now, I don't think there's any space for community in that equation. Not formalized, right? It is kind of, there are conversations that are changing in the land trust community, which is encouraging. But I think what you have raised is really important. I think on the short term, like looking at and considering food systems as a resilient and capable, because during COVID, we all turned to local food, right? Everybody wanted to go to the farmer's market. Everybody wanted to purchase locally. And some of that, I think, has changed. But, until we kind of have that local connection as a firm value system, both, so that there are prices that are affordable for the farmers that are growing and contributing to the local food system, but also affordable access for people to go to the farmer's market or go to the CSA or purchase something that isn't from, the grocery store or Walmart. That's going to be a choice that people have to make affirmatively, because if you don't have money, you can't necessarily make that choice. But I think that there are policies that could be in place that could help people make that choice better. It's just, we don't have that right now.
Yeah, I feel like we need to find ways to think about what's going to happen with the future shocks to our ecosystems. And when people began to really be feeling hunger, I think that would be the time to try to switch from this individualistic approach to land ownership toward a more collective governance, as you was talking about, Nathan. Collective governance, collective decision-making, ownership, ways of marketing together. In Louisville, we're trying a new program that I'm helping to coordinate, where we're having some of the farmers, immigrant farmers, producing medicinal and niche crops that are really popular in their own home communities, East African communities, Asian communities, as medicine for prevention of illness, and as very high nutrient foods like amaranth, like some of the greens that are consumed widely by people from global South countries and Asia and Middle East, etc. So I'm thinking kind of in a middle and long term that we need to keep fighting for whatever access we have to land, because it's going to become extremely important at some future time, and a way for us to build community around health and nutrition. I don't know if that makes you think of some aspects of your own work around land and land loss.
I mean, I think I'm kind of going back to something that you said earlier, because part of the work that we do is to work with folks that want to come together and manage land together in that collective, and kind of strengthening their ability to do that. And you described it really well, because like using the legal structures that we have, and then creating your own, like, so the legal structure would be the box, and then the rules that you use for land transition, land access, decision making, like who is going to be a part of this body, is kind of, you create that inside the box. However you want to see it, how do you want to see it pass on? How do you want to see new members? And, being able to do that kind of work is like the encouraging side for us. It's a part of transition planning. It's a part of, a necessary thing for individuals to come together to bring their capital together to be able to purchase land, and then kind of utilize it to support land-based businesses or farming. It becomes very community focused and community centered. And so that's where my mind is going. And I feel like there are some really innovative things happening, that it gives me hope. And I think the more we kind of share that, and then like the work that Agrarian Trust is doing, I think it allows other people to think outside the box.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great answer. And the another thing that you said earlier, Stephen, of course, it's such a topic of conversation right now, not just the anti-immigrant sentiment, but now actual actions taken by our government that have defied belief. I mean, frankly, we are, I've heard it described as unprecedented territory, but the fact is it's not unprecedented territory. Violence and theft is baked into the fabric of this country. And I mean, forget about the fact, just for a moment, take colonially defined borders out of the equation, realizing that particularly when we're talking about Central American, South American, that those migration patterns long predate the United States in terms of human movement. And that's not just speculation either, but also it's so important for us to know our history. You have to know where you're from to know where you're at. And it's oftentimes we look at terrible things that have happened in our history and we want to move on, or we want to reconcile and resolve and then immediately conclude to unify, instead of allowing the pain to metabolize and let the lessons kind of rise to the surface and be integrated. But again, we talk about the ethos or the values. By far and large, it is this avoidance of accountability, of complexity, of conflict, which serves some people, but doesn't serve the great majority, right? And I talk about our history because you mentioned about farm workers and Central American farm workers and workers from Mexico. And y'all were probably familiar with the Bracero program, of the 30s and 40s. I say 90% of the people that I speak with have no concept of this action that was taken by the government and I guess you could say kind of like global or continent-wide political history and all the factors that led to some of the underpinnings of the system that we have now. But with that history in place and the struggles that farm workers have faced and continue to face in this country, the sentiment should not be of vitriol. It should be of reconciliation and gratitude for incredibly resilient people that are still here and are still members of our respective communities rurally. So there there was a question in here about 40 acres and a mule, and I was thinking about that ahead of this. That's a deep question, but that tied to our history, right? This is a moment that is often, I learned about it in public elementary school in Georgia, that a moment that is at least remembered in a way where land theft and forced labor and the legacy of slavery was acknowledged, and it was indicated that repair was required. And also this, if we can call it a policy action or a standpoint, was reversed violently and politically. And the land, and this is 40 acres and a mule specific to formerly enslaved folks, but the same thing happened with the allotment system for indigenous communities, right? And point being that through theft and ill dealing, this land remained concentrated in the hands of those beneficiaries, many which are those that have inherited masses of land today, right? And so this is a very important historical and political context that informs our circumstances when we want to go and talk about the next generation of farmers, or beginning farmers, if we use that kind of terminology. In many ways, I don't know if this is in vogue or not, but I have also heard the term reconnecting farmer kind of come up, which ties to this idea that eating, production of food, is deeply human, and regardless of your cultural, regional, socioeconomic context, it's inherent in all of us. Right. So a beginning farmer would be like a child, not 35, and then after 35, you're no longer a young farmer. And if you've been farming less than 10 years or over 10 years now, you're no longer a beginning farmer. I think anyone who's engaged in agriculture would clearly, say that it is a lifetime's worth journey, right? How many seasons do you have in one lifetime compared to the scale of the natural world? So, right, all of these things are compounding when we're talking about this transition. So, I think it's important to acknowledge that in many ways, when we talk about reform, it can be kind of a scary word in the context of some international movements to talk about land reform in this country. But we do have nodes that we can point to and acknowledge. that each come with their own histories of harm attached to it. But yeah, so I think this is a part of why we talk about tenure as opposed to access, because access alone doesn't change power, and tenure doesn't necessarily have to equate ownership, and that is a thread that in our current legal and political context is very difficult to parse for a lot of us.
Yes, thank you, Nathan. There's a lot to unpack there. I think we could spend many hours just on some of those points. I was thinking about my understanding of collective governance around land was especially due to my working with as an ally of the landless rural workers movement of Brazil and of indigenous folks in the Americas and other groups like that. And the idea that they were able to push in the Constitution of Brazil at the end of the military dictatorship was that land should serve its social function. And they defined that specifically, that there shouldn't be labor abuse, there shouldn't be idleness, it shouldn't be speculative land ownership, that there shouldn't be, did I say labor abuses or environmental abuses of the land? And therefore, such land should be open to agrarian reform. And the government had a small Department of Agrarian Reform, which the landless rural workers movement kind of helped make into a real thing. By beginning to occupy, there were 5 million landless people at that time who had been pushed off their small-scale farms in Brazil, and they began organizing large campments along roads and then occupying land until and withstanding the violence from whoever thought that they should control that land, and then creating their own collectives and cooperatives and agricultural settlements by mass occupations, and then pushing for agrarian reform, basically from facts on the ground, which is you have a 200-acre farm now occupied by 10,000 landless workers, and we need to find a way to, and then they would create these beautiful agro villages to make it to make it economically feasible to have settlements, and then the land around the settlements would be worked by the workers. And their effort was always to try to make as much of that land worked cooperatively. But because of the mentality also of many of the farmers, I wouldn't say most, but a lot of the farmers wanted to have individual plots. For them, that was the idea of having some sovereignty for their own families, Mm-hmm. And so that was so they didn't require them to do cooperative, but they encouraged that. And so many of the settlements in Brazil had a combination of individual land working and cooperative working. And with the idea of over time showing the advantages of the cooperative model. Mm-hmm. And of course, as we know, they've been through a lot of ups and downs, but they were able to get, 2 million people resettled on land in Brazil. 200 million, 2.5 million, some people say, were able to get land. And they again fought with the issue of you can have land and it's still not be viable economically. Mm-hmm. So they're facing a lot of the same dynamics that we have in the United States of trying to make small-scale farming economically viable model.
I think part of what is important too is that there's a question here about gentrification, like mm-hmm. gentrification in the rural context. And I feel like if you look at the literal definition of gentrification from Webster's, it basically says that gentrification is a process in which a poor area, as of a city, experiences an influx of middle class or wealthy people who renovate and rebuild homes and businesses, and which often results in an increase in property values and the displacement of earlier, usually poor residents. And that's literally what's happening in the rural context. Mm-hmm. So I don't think there's a difference between gentrification in a rural and an urban.
Mm-hmm. Nathan, with Agrarian Trust, can you describe some of the land tenancy work that you're doing and why you say that tenancy is the needed concept versus just access, and what that means, what land tenancy means.
Yeah. I appreciate so much of this conversation and also what you just framed, Stephen. I'm thinking about international movements and how they have influenced the formation and the continued work of Agrarian Trust. And, AT is going to be turning 10 this year, 10 years old as an organization, which in this scale of time, these things that we're talking about is so short. But in that time, we have been able to kind of ground truth. Some of these the learnings and the nectar from some of these international movements that have been kind of distilled into what I have experienced in some circles as a kind of high-minded ideal of what the commons could be, and grounding that into a very wise and common sense understanding of how these principles operate on the ground, all while navigating the nonprofit industrial complex and the American legal and political systems. No easy feat. So you have to be nimble. But land access, we can affect access without changing power, but it is the door. So in the Agrarian Trust logo, right now it's kind of the structure of a house, which is a little bit of, it's the A and T together, but it's also this. So to follow this home kind of analogy, land access is the door or the point of entry, right? And land tenure is the foundation. Okay, and so tenancy is long term, it's secure, it is inheritable, it is renewable rights to land beyond access that don't disappear in a moment of crisis, a resilient infrastructure. And ultimately, this is the intention of the commons, is to be this regionally autonomous and community controlled repository for this land that is in transition. And this is borrowing from the kind of ideology of international movements. So the strategies that are there already within the active commons, long-term ground leases, some conservation easements or conservation lease models, some affordability structures that borrow from community land trust movements, and the board structures and resale equations, equity models, you might call that. So tenancy is what happens when these forms of collaborative governance they take flight under a long-term plan, a life plan, as opposed to just a kind of temporary flash in the pan. Because look, there's no shortage of farms that are community-based and supported by nonprofits and NGOs that have been formed in the last, take your pick, decade, that have popped up, funded by grant money, and as soon as that funding ran out, that project collapsed upon itself. This is an example of the high-minded ideal being put into practice without a secure foundation or secure infrastructure that is going to allow the community, not a white-led national organization, to determine the future or the success of that organization. So without secure tenure, these concepts that we're talking about are just nice ideas. And so if you want intergenerational farming, you need secure intergenerational tenure. And that's where the commons model is trying to land, this durable tenure that we're talking about without speculative ownership. And this includes disrupting the kind of generally agreed upon consensus that the building of private wealth can only be accomplished through private ownership. And so, well, there's no equity in the equation without ownership. That's the assumption we're challenging.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've often thought, well, my friend and I, who have these philosophical conversations, he was just saying, no, it's just wrong from the beginning to say that humans can own land. So the concept of individual ownership is an illusion because the land will far outlive any owner, right? So we should mention that coming up soon in a couple of days, actually, is a big gathering in Cartagena, Colombia, called the ICARD, ICARRD. It's a gathering that took place. I guess the last one was back in more than 15 years ago, and is long due. And the theme of this gathering in Cartagena will be land ownership and access tenure, land issues across the hemisphere. And so Family Farm Defenders and the U.S. Food Sovereignty Alliance and the National Family Farm Coalition are all sending folks. Maybe Land Loss is also going there, Annette?
Yeah, I'm really, really excited because I get to attend the International Conference on Agrarian Reform and Rural Development. It is the second event, the first one being held 20 years ago in Brazil. And this year, this time, it is hosted by the government of Colombia as a multilateral conference, and it will bring together individuals from all over the world to consider issues of land access and protection of small-scale food producers. And in this time, especially land rights issues are more relevant than ever for rural communities, not only in the U.S., but globally. And it's to encourage political action at the national and international levels to support farmers and rural communities, and particularly to kind of make sure that some of these international governance documents are part of that equation. And so the encouraging the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and the Committee on World Food Security to monitor the implementation of voluntary guidelines and responsible governments of tenure, and making sure that centered in those discussions is like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and Other People Working in Rural Areas, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, just to make sure that those are central pillars of any kind of agrarian reform. So I'm really just excited to be there and listen and learn and kind of join with many of the allies across the country and in the region, but definitely going for the National Family Farm Coalition and as a member of Via Campesina.
Just a really quick comment kind of on the end of talking about ICARD, just to say, especially supporting a lot of indigenous-led efforts around land reform and being able to attend some of these convenings that are a little closer to me in the States to get to is so reaffirming how international spaces really help to clarify and name what domestic politics tries to hide in our 24-hour news cycle and all of the distractions that are out there. And that, obviously our context here in the States is so hyper local, and we see that with the different regions across the country, but land grabbing is global. And the forces that move within the US are also operating globally. And so we need shared language for shared problems.
Thank you, Annette and Nathan, for this very informative and thought-provoking discussion. Family Farm Defenders is really happy and grateful that you've taken the time to be with us today to discuss land tenure, land justice, food sovereignty, and a future that's in right relationship, not only between humans, but also between humans and all living things, and the living world around us, that make our lives possible, right? That we actually emerge from the dust of the stardust of our cosmos, right? So Family Farm Defenders, again, is very grateful. Thank you very much for taking the time to share your perspectives and knowledge about these very important questions. And it's been a great pleasure for us. Thank you very much. And we hope to hear back from you again in the future, in not too distant future. Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.